Our next speaker this afternoon is Dr. Charles Lafon. Charles Lafon is a professor of geography at Texas A&M University, where he teaches and conducts research in physical geography with an emphasis on biogeography. His research focuses on vegetation patterns and change, including the role of fires, storms, and other disturbances. He is especially interested in fire history and the spatial patterning of fire on Appalachian landscapes. A native of the Appalachian landscapes of southwestern Virginia, he earned his bachelor's degree from Emory and Henry College and his master's and Ph.D. from the University of Tennessee. Welcome, Charles.
Thanks, Ryan. Let me start by making sure that you can hear me and see my screen. Can you confirm that?
Yes.
Good, thanks. All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to participate today. I've learned a lot already. My talk is going to differ a little bit from the others in that I'm not talking directly about carbon or carbon sequestration, but I'll be talking about fire, and that is relevant to, I think fire has been mentioned in every talk so far today. So it's relevant to the management of the vegetation in the Appalachians that you managers are dealing with every day. So as you're all familiar, there are many different fire adaptive plants, like the Peters Mountain mallow on the left, and vegetation types like the oak forest and the Table Mountain pine forest on the right side of this screen. And these are actually fairly widespread in the Appalachian Mountains. And therefore, fire is an important management tool in natural areas and for natural area management. But fire and smoke are also natural hazards. And fire is affected by climate. Both wildfire and prescribed fire are affected by climate. And so fire also has implications for carbon sequestrations, and therefore climate change is a necessary topic to consider in fire management. As Ryan mentioned, if you were wondering why a professor from Texas A&M is interested in Appalachian forests and landscapes, my background there in the mountains of Southwest Virginia should answer that question. I'm very interested in Appalachian landscapes. I love the landscapes there, and I've done quite a bit of work on the vegetation and vegetation-climate relationships and fire and other disturbances in the Appalachian Mountains. So today I want to talk about three different points. The first and the primary reason I think that I'm invited to give this talk is I want to talk about historical fire regimes as context for understanding present Appalachian landscapes. I also want to talk about how disruption of historical fire regime has altered vegetation. And then I want to think about some implications for natural areas management when considering climate change. So first of all, historical fire regimes as context for understanding present Appalachian landscapes. Actually, before I go to historical fire regimes, I want to talk a little bit about current fire regime, because the current fire regime gives us some indications, provides us some knowledge that we don't have when we look at proxy records of historical fires. And then I'm going to look at proxy record reconstructions of historical fire regimes. So first, a little bit about the current fire regime. This map on the left is from the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity database, which provides access GIS data on fires over 500 acres, so all the large fires. And this map itself is one that we created for the publication that listed down at the bottom, Fire History of the Appalachian Region, a Review and Synthesis. This was published in 2017. I was an author along with Adam Naito, Henry Garcia Mayer, Sally Horn, and Tom Waldrop. And that was, it's a U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station General Technical Report. So I think the link is going to be provided for everyone. It will provide much more detail about many of the different studies that I discussed today. So today's talk will hit the highlights of a number of topics, but we can discuss more of those in detail in the Q&A, but also you can find more information about those in that publication. And I would also mention that report was supported by the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, which covers the entire region from Pennsylvania south to Alabama and Georgia. Okay, so fires are fairly rare today, even though when you look at those points, it looks as if they cover a lot of the map. If you zoom into the individual landscape, you'll see they don't cover nearly as much area as they seem to when they just look at the size of the dot on the map. But they provide some knowledge of fire patterns that may help us interpret historical fire regimes. For example, this is just one bit of data that we include in that GTR. The length of of fire-free intervals and their influence on fire occurrence. This is from a section of the Ridge and Valley in Virginia and West Virginia. On the x-axis is the number of consecutive dry days, and so length of dry spell. And on the y-axis is the probability of ignition. And you can see there's a pretty strong relationship, but as the number of dry days, rain-free days increases, the probability of ignition increases linearly. And so that matters, that probably mattered in historical fire regimes as well. And when we think about spatial differences between different regions of the Appalachians, for example, some places have more sporadic rainfall with longer dry spells than others. And with regard to climate variability and climate change, climatic change could result in greater climatic variability that could increase the probability of fire. So that's the kind of information we can get from the current fire regime that may help us interpret past fire regimes and future fire regimes for that matter. There are some obvious spatial patterns on that map. They're undoubtedly affected by current land use, but they also probably reflect physical conditions like climate and terrain and vegetation that don't change as rapidly and therefore can help us interpret past fire regimes. So this is the little rectangle I've drawn there in Virginia and West Virginia is going to be the focus of a little study that I include on the next slide. That provides some interesting information, insights about how fires operate. So for this, we were not looking at only the large fires, but all the fires that occur on the federally managed lands, the national forests and national parks in eastern West Virginia and western Virginia for a 34-year period. And we calculated the fire cycle. The fire cycle would just be the length of the number of years that would be required for at the rate of burning during that 34-year period for the entire landscape to burn. So think about all the area that's burned each year. How many years of that amount of burning would it take to burn that entire landscape? And so we looked at 3 different physiographic provinces: the Appalachian Plateau, the Ridge and Valley, and the Blue Ridge. And this is only part of the Appalachian Plateau. It's that high Allegheny Mountain section there that's covered by the Monongahela National Forest. Again, these fires were only on public lands. 10,000 nearly 11,000 year fire cycles. In other words, it would take 11,000 years at the current rate of burning to burn an area equivalent to the whole that Monongahela National Forest area. Of course, all the fires, they're not randomly located. Some occur in some areas more frequently than others, but that's just one measure of the fire regime today. Fires are uncommon. In the Ridge and Valley, it's considerably shorter, even though still over a millennium, fire cycle is pretty long. And even in the Blue Ridge, it's much shorter, but the Blue Ridge still doesn't have much fire today compared to the historical burning that we understand was occurring. But nonetheless, there's a dramatic spatial difference there that in part likely results from differences in precipitation regime. As you probably are familiar with, that high Appalachian Plateau region is cool and wet, but actually the Blue Ridge has about the same amount of annual precipitation on average as the high Appalachian Plateau there. But the precipitation delivery regime is quite different, with the Blue Ridge more prone to intense rainfall events separated by long dry spells, whereas that would permit time for litter to dry, whereas the Appalachian Plateau over there in the Monongahela would be more prone to frequent but less intense rainfall that would keep the fuels wetter. So those kind of differences exist today and undoubtedly existed in the past as well, and can help us then interpret past fire regimes. Another thing that emerges here is just the importance of large fires for the overall fire regime. Looking at the Appalachian Plateau, there were 252 wildfires, both anthropogenic and lightning ignited, during that 34-year period. But of those 252, only 13 of them, the largest 13, accounted for half of the area burned. Without those 13 fires, there would have been half as much landscape burned as there was. On the Blue Ridge, the fire size distribution is even more strongly skewed. There were 600 plus wildfires, but only 3 largest ones accounted for over half of the area burned. So that 0.5% of all fires accounted for the majority of the area burned. So large fires are highly important for the fire regime, and that's important to remember for thinking about the past fire regimes as well. In terms of those spatial differences, precipitation regime probably contributed, as well as landscape structure, like the size of slopes and the number of the vegetation type and things like that. And I would just briefly mention here something we might want to cover a little more later, but there are some interesting terrain atmosphere interactions, especially in the Blue Ridge and parts of the Ridge Valley in terms of convection, lightning, and lightning ignitions. Most of the wildfires that occur in the Appalachians and the eastern U.S. today are anthropogenic in origin. However, there are quite a bit of there's quite a bit of lightning ignition in the along the Blue Ridge there. About 24% of those fires were ignited by lightning, and about 18% in the Ridge and Valley. And I don't know whether that extends up into the South Mountain area, the northern extension of the Blue Ridge in Pennsylvania, but it certainly is true down in the southern Blue Ridge and places like North Carolina and Tennessee, with quite a few lightning ignitions along the Blue Ridge escarpments there. So that has implications for vegetation, plant adaptations to fire, and the long history of fire in the region. Okay, so let's talk about the historical fire regime as inferred from proxy records. And tree rings are one of the fire scar trees are one of the main forms of evidence here that we've done a lot of research with. That's a fire scarred pine tree there on the left. Most of this research comes from Table Mountain pine and pitch pine trees. And so there's a tree that has endured many fires in the past and healed over those wounds, partially healed over the wounds. These were obviously not severe enough to kill that particular tree, but it scarred and injured the tree, and it still bears the wounds. So we saw cross sections from those trees, take the cross sections back to the lab, sand them down so the tree rings become distinct and visible. And then we can also, once the tree rings are dated, we can date the fire scars and determine how frequently fires occurred and what years they occurred in and how they relate to drought and those kinds of things. On the screen here, it looks kind of faded on my screen, but hopefully you can see it well. This is a fire chronology for Reddish Knob on the George Washington National Forest in Virginia, near the West Virginia border. And what you should see here is this fire chart is the compilation of a lot of fire scarred trees from that particular mountainside. On the x-axis at the bottom, from 1650 to 2000, that's the timeline for all the trees covered by the trees in that particular study. Each one of those horizontal lines represents the time span by a particular tree. So there are 60 or 70 trees at this particular site. Each one of the vertical hatch marks represents a dated fire scar on an individual tree. And then down at the bottom, you see the composite fire axis. That's a composite of all the fires covered by all the trees in that particular stand. So a couple things to note is, first of all, there were not many fires after 1913, the last fire on the last major fire that occurred there. This is the fire suppression era. Fires dramatically declined, having burned very frequently before that. In fact, the average return interval there from the 1600s up until 1913 was 5 years. There was some variation around that mean, but a 5-year interval. This is a frequent fire regime that no doubt maintained more open forest and so forth than we see today. There's some other information you can glean from this fire chart about past fire regimes. If you look back in the late 1600s, and early 1700s, there's a cohort of trees that established them. These are pine stands, Table Mountain pine, pitch pine. And so you notice that the timelines for a lot of those trees stack up right together. So they all those trees originated around the same time. That probably suggests that a fire of greater severity occurred then. And we also see a similar one in the mid 1800s with a number of trees becoming established right after that. And so what we probably have evidence for here in those pine stands is a regime of frequent, mild to moderate surface fires that maintained an open stand that was dominated by pines, punctuated occasionally by more severe fires that opened the stand a bit more and allowed for larger cohorts of trees to establish. And we see this more clearly at some other study sites. This is in Linville Mountain, North Carolina, on the Blue Ridge Escarpment of Western North Carolina. A similar fire regime, 4-year return interval, so frequent fires. But notice there are 3 cohorts that established there that probably, again, indicate fairly severe fires at levels at intervals of about a century, punctuated by that were just that were punctuations between more frequent fires that were occurring on an average of about a 4-year interval. All right, for that synthesis study I mentioned, we combine the records that we could find, not just our own, but also other studies that have been done in the Appalachian Mountains. And for the 42 sites that we were able to get data for, the minimum fire return interval was 2 years, and that was for a couple sites in Southwest Virginia and East Tennessee and the Smoky Mountains. The longest one was 20 years at a site in eastern West Virginia, but the average was 7 years. So across this Appalachian region, fires occur frequently before suppression. I would note that there was a great range in sample size from 9 fire-scarred trees to 116. And so some of the differences that you see here in return interval are probably not real as much as they are an artifact of sample size. The greater number of trees you sampled, the more likely you are to pick up some fire scars. This is just an attempt to see if any spatial patterns appear to emerge in fire frequency. The larger circles represent shorter fire intervals. The smaller circles represent longer fire intervals. If there's anything that appears there, it seems that the Ridge and Valley and the Blue Ridge on the east and the western edge of the plateau over on the west may have had more frequent fires than, say, the Appalachian Plateau there in the center. But there's really not enough data in the Appalachian Plateau to make that a firm conclusion. Some of you who are in Pennsylvania, given the Pennsylvania focus of this symposium, may have noted that there's a big gap in the Ridge and Valley of Pennsylvania. 1 year after we published this general technical report, Mike Stembaugh and co-authors published a study that included a number of fire history sites in the Ridge and Valley in Pennsylvania. And those sites are shown on the map on the left, the fire charts on the right. And I would note that those look similar in terms of return intervals as we saw in the Ridge and Valley in Virginia and Tennessee and so forth, 5 to 8 year return interval or so on average. So the Ridge and Valley of Pennsylvania seems to have had a similar fire regime as other points in the Appalachians. Okay, so we had frequent burning in the past, and a question that arises is, how was this frequent burning maintained? No doubt there were times in the past when there were more ignitions than there are today. I mean, there were land uses, agricultural land uses, hunting and gathering, and very encouragement of blueberry production and so forth that would have prompted people to use fire more commonly. But also fire sizes were probably larger as well. The landscapes were not fragmented as they are today. Fuels were more continuous, maybe more flammable, given that fires occurred frequently and maintained the flammable oak, pine kind of forest and woodland structure. Forests were probably more open, and so they dried out quicker and those kind of things. In our studies, we collected fire scars from multiple pine stands. This is in Brush Mountain in Southwest Virginia. Looking toward the south, this is the north side of the mountain, and you can see the dark colored Table Mountain pine, pitch pines on the right or the west sides of those spurs. And we collected from multiple pine stands. And one thing that we noticed is that many of the fires that we recorded were found across all the stands, and for that matter, likely encompass much larger areas. So even during periods of low population density or during or in sites that were fairly remote from human use, frequent fire interval or short fire intervals could have been maintained by large fires that spread over large areas of the landscape, even from sparse ignition points. So fire is, I want to emphasize, a landscape phenomenon, as you're all aware. And this leads us to this topic of landscape fire ecology. In the last 10 to 20 years, especially in the Western US, it's become increasingly appreciated that we can't just understand fire regimes on the basis of climate or some big top-down control like that, but fire as a contagious disturbance is affected by climate, but also by what might be called bottom-up controls, like rock outcrops, terrain, streams, vegetation. And this is summed up, that paper at the bottom there is kind of a seminal study on landscape fire ecology with a focus on the Western US, but it matters for the East too. Landscape structure creates burn and vegetation patchiness. That's an important concept in landscape ecology, is the patchiness of the landscape. Connectivity is important in thinking about landscape ecology of fire, because as a contagious disturbance, if it ignites in one place, in order to burn an entire landscape, it has to be flammable patches of the landscape must be connected to each other. And that's going to change as through a drought, for example. So as a drought intensifies or extends temporally, then the landscape itself becomes, the dry patches on the landscape become more connected to each other, more conducive to fire spread, which means that in the past, we probably saw larger fires during drought years, just as we do today. Nonetheless, even under a changing climate, even under if droughts become more severe or more intense or more widespread, landscape structure and ecological memory, feedbacks between vegetation and fire that that feed back all the way to the past fire regime continue to constrain the fire regime and vegetation pattern to some extent. So this harkens back to the earlier talk today with Mark Anderson, thinking about landscape structure, rock types, and microtopography. All those things go into determining vegetation. They also help to determine fire regime. So fire is a landscape phenomenon. Even though it's been recognized in the West and talked about more in the West than the East, the earliest really study on landscape fire ecology was by Cecil Frost, his dissertation published in 2000, in which he included a chapter called Components of Landscape Fire Ecology in the Southeastern US. So we can't let the Western US have all the credit for this topic. In fact, Cecil Frost used the landscape fire ecology concept to help him map what he thought might have been the pre-settlement fire regimes of the US, and we reproduce part of that map in that general technical report. You would note that he maps frequent fire regimes over the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic through the Appalachians, but the fire regime that he inferred or he estimated back in 1998 to 2000 using his methods turned out to be an underestimate of how frequently fires occurred on the most flammable parts of the landscape. We see, instead of intervals of 7 to 25 or whatever years that he had mapped, we see more like 2, 4, 8-year return intervals. Okay, one shortcoming of fire scarred trees is that they are limited in temporal extent. They are limited by the maximum lifespan of trees and by the decay of the trees out on the landscape. And so sediment charcoal and soil charcoal provide other means for looking at fires and fire history over a longer time scale, but at lower resolution. We can't tell you which year they occurred in. That's my PhD advisor, in fact, there, Sally Horn, looking at, with some students, they're coring a bog to look at both charcoal and pollen that they can glean by sampling the mud from the bottom of the pond. There have been a few sediment charcoal studies in the Appalachians. One drawback of the Appalachians is that most of it hasn't been glaciated except for the northern edge, and so there are not many wetlands of quality that are sufficient for conducting sediment charcoal analyses. All those green squares represent sediment cores, sediment charcoal studies of fire history in the Appalachians. And so I want to look at a couple of those, not in detail, but just a couple of those. The resolution of the temporal resolution of the sediment core is primarily a result of how rapidly the sedimentation occurred. And so in ponds or bogs that were situated so as to have a high erosion rate from the surrounding landscape and rapid sedimentation, you can tease apart finer resolution records. And this one from Trout Pond in the Ridge and Valley of eastern West Virginia is a good one. It shows that it seems to imply that fires were occurring fairly rapidly or fairly regularly, punctuated occasionally by more severe fires. It really seems to match what we see from the tree ring studies. This is a longer one from Ely Lake up in Pennsylvania, which isn't a glaciated area. Again, a similar pattern. The different colors there in the background of blue represent different archaeological periods. And in that particular case, Clark and Royal had expected to see a greater influence of Iroquois agricultural use, but it turns out that didn't really appear, probably because the site was a little too remote from village sites. Nonetheless, there was frequent burning, it appears, similar to what we saw in Trout Pond. There are more coarse resolution records where the sedimentation rate wasn't high enough to give the kind of temporal resolution we saw in the previous ones, but they usually go back further in time. This is a well-known one, Delcourt et al. From Cliff Palace Pond, Kentucky, where there's a 10,000-year record. So it dates through spans much of the Holocene. There was quite a bit of charcoal early on and then a decline, but by about 3,000 years ago, with the advent of this is an agricultural center, charcoal production increased, and we also have pollen plotted on there. The brown line at the top is oak pollen. So charcoal and pollen increased in step with each other, which is not surprising given the fire oak hypothesis. Here's one from the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, 20,000 year almost record. This is in a place that's geomorphically not very well suited to receive much sediment. So it's a really low sedimentation rate, but nonetheless, Charcoal is present throughout the entire Holocene and even back into the Pleistocene in this record. Soil charcoal is more widely available in the Appalachians. Soil charcoal is everywhere there's been fire on the landscape, and soil charcoal is recalcitrant, a lot more recalcitrant than other forms of organic matter in the soil, and so can last for hundreds or thousands of years. And those yellow squares represent places in the Appalachians where there have been soil charcoal studies. A couple of those, one in western North Carolina and one in East Tennessee and the Smokies, both show evidence for soil charcoal for fire having occurred there on a somewhat regular basis throughout the Holocene, it appears. Okay, so that's fire history in a nutshell, but let's move on to how disruption of the historical fire regime has altered vegetation. This is related to this mesophytic term that Nowacki and Abrams have discussed and others. And in a nutshell, the idea is that oak and pine woodlands and forests that were xerophytic in nature, that were maintained by frequent burning in the past, have, in the absence of fire, become denser and shadier. The leaf litter they've been encroached by mesophytic species that have leaf litter that's less flammable and decomposes more rapidly, eventually converting these forests towards something that's less flammable in the future and a completely different forest type. And so there are many different approaches to examine mesophycation. I'm going to look at just one bit of work that we've done. This is really from the PhD dissertation of one of my former students, Will Flatley. And so this is in the Western Smoky Mountains, an area that was unlogged, an unlogged drainage basin. Topographic map here shows the different colors here represent different types of vegetation. The dark green is the yellow pine, table mountain pine, pitch pine, Virginia pine. The light green is white pine. The brown is oak, and the white is mesophytic cove forest, mixed mesophytic cove forest. The little rectangles all over the slope represent fire-scarred trees. So this one has over 100 fire-scarred trees. So we have a good understanding of the fire history of that particular slope. The different little squares on there represent plots where we sampled vegetation across the topographic gradient from the pine stands down to the oak stands, all the way down to the mesophytic forest along the branch. So we were interested in how fire, frequent burning in the past, as well as fire suppression over the past century, have influenced stand dynamics and vegetation patterning along that entire drainage basin, along the entire topographic gradient. So I'm not going to have time to detail this, but we can talk about it more later if anybody would like. But we have evidence that fire helped to maintain the topographic vegetation gradient that we all often associate with moisture gradient, and moisture is part of the story, but also fire itself is part of the story in maintaining the topographic gradient from pine to oak down to mesophytic forest. So we probably had a pattern here of a fairly open vegetation that was maintained by frequent burning in the past. I want to just look at the oak stands here just briefly because of the widespread interest that people have in oaks and oak management. On the x-axis here we have the decade. The y-axis we're looking at, this is a histogram. The y-axis shows the number of recruited individuals per acre. So this is density of recruitment based on coring trees and when those trees established. So these are the trees that currently exist on the landscape today. When were they recruited? The orange bars are oaks. This is an oak stand, so not surprisingly, there were oaks recruited back in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, up to the early 1900s under a regime of frequent fire. Every few years there was a fire. And so there was some recruitment. It was probably not dense, but a fairly open oak stand appears to have been maintained. There was a little bit of pine there, that green one back in the late 1700s. The other species there, the blues, include everything from hickories to hemlocks. There was umbrella magnolia in there, red maples, etc. So a mix of species. This is up on the oak stands. The last major fire occurred in 1916. So we see this oak forest maintained by frequent burning up through the early 20th century. Immediately after that, however, mesophycation started rapidly. Beginning in that decade, the oaks and pines actually recruited at a higher level than they had in the past. But what's the big story here, of course, is the rapid increase in the establishment of all the other the other species. So this is a picture of mesophycation here over the last century as a consequence, as a very clear consequence of the suppression of fire. Another thing we could talk about, another component of mesophycation, is the increase in shrub thickets of ericaceous shrubs. Here's a picture of a Table Mountain pine, pitch pine stand in the George Washington National Forest that has almost no pine recruitment today. It's just absolutely choked with mountain laurel and understory. There are thousands of acres of this kind of vegetation in the Appalachians. Okay, so then finally, I want to talk about some implications for natural areas management when considering climate change. So here I am not talking about anything that's within my area of expertise, but I wanted to connect it, especially for the managers here, connect the fire regime research that I've discussed to management in the context of climate change that this conference is about. And so I don't claim to have any expertise, but this did give me an excuse to explore the literature just a little bit on some topics related to fire management and climate change, carbon sequestration, and so forth. So I want to break this into three categories briefly here. First, carbon sequestration and fire. Second, resistance of forests to wildfire and other disturbances, particularly stress from drought. And then climate change and the prognosis for wildfires and prescribed burning. So first of all, carbon sequestration and fire. There are several papers that deal with this, but there really doesn't seem to be, at least from my fairly cursory research, there don't seem to be a lot of papers written on this topic so far. But in general, if I were to summarize what these have to say, it's that that frequent prescribed burning that maintain production of pine and oak, and that maintain production of pyrogenic carbon charcoal inputs into the soil can be an important tool in maintaining carbon sequestration and carbon storage in Appalachian ecosystems. That final paper there, short-term effects of recent fire on the production and translocation of pyrogenic carbon in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, is a particularly interesting one that we could come back to if anybody is interested. But there seems to be no, from the research that's been done, there really isn't any impetus here for halting prescribed burning in order to sequester more carbon. Prescribed burning seems to have an important role to play in maintaining the integrity of forest and for producing, continuing to contribute charcoal to the soil that helps to store carbon, because charcoal is more recalcitrant than other forms of organic matter in the soil. A second topic of resistance to wildfire and other disturbances. Here I use the term resistance rather than resilience, because resistance really has the more precise meaning that I want to get at here, and that is helping forests to resist catastrophic loss from wildfire or drought stress or other disturbances like southern pine beetle outbreaks, for example. And so this one is interesting. Carpenter et al. Benefit or liability. The ectomycorrhizal association may undermine tree adaptations to fire after long-term fire exclusion. This one's important because it illustrates how complicated it really is to manage, and how complicated the environment is, how many different contributing factors there are, and the kinds of unexpected consequences that may emerge out of something like fire suppression. This was based on the Rock Mountain fire that occurred in Georgia and North Carolina, the Southern Blue Ridge, back in 2016, which, as many of you are familiar with, was a severe drought year in the Southern Blue Ridge Mountains. Fire had been suppressed there for decades, and as a consequence, a heavy litter layer, a heavy organic matter layer, had accumulated in the soil. And so the real irony was, that the title alludes to, is that the fire-resistant adaptations of the oaks and pines and their the relationship with ectomycorrhizal fungi probably ended up making them less resistant to catastrophic mortality as a result of this fire. That fire, because of the droughty conditions, burned the litter layer and the duff layer down to organic, down to the mineral soil in some places. What had happened, so this is the recalcitrant leaf litter of the oaks and pines is actually a benefit to those species on infertile sites where nutrient retention is important, and it actually is beneficial to them in terms of promoting fire, and which helps exclude competing species. It's a great adaptation for life in a xeric site that's frequently burned by fire. But over the course of the 20th century, under fire suppression, that recalcitrant litter has accumulated to such a depth that that roots, the fine roots, have built up into that organic matter layer. Consequently, when the organic matter was destroyed by catastrophic fire, it burned up a lot of roots and killed roots. And as a consequence, trees of all species, the mesophytic trees that were mixed in, as well as the oaks and pines and hickories that are generally thought of as more fire resistant, those have all been succumbing to mortality. Some of that's delayed mortality as a consequence of that fire. So here we have a case where fire suppression has led to a pulse probably of carbon release into the atmosphere. The recommendation of this paper was prescribe fire, light fires that don't burn to death all in one fell swoop would help to encourage the gradual reduction of the duff layer, encourage the trees to begin rooting further down into the mineral soil, so as to protect them from this kind of catastrophic carbon loss in the future. And the Clark et al. Climate Change and Fire Management in the Mid-Atlantic region makes a similar case based on a variety of different techniques, including modeling, that prescribed burning can be an important part of managing forests to prevent severe wildfire loss of carbon in the future. Resistance to stress and to drought stress, and there are a number of dendroecological papers that show, for example, that drought tolerant fire favored tree species like oaks and pines are more drought resistant, less sensitive to drought than are the mesophytic species. So you can imagine then that as mesophication has proceeded in the absence of frequent burning, that the forests have become, even on the uplands where the mesophytic trees are encroaching in, the forest is becoming increasingly stressed, even without climate change. Even without climate change, the forest is becoming more stressed by climatic anomalies like droughts because they're becoming more mesophytic and more crowded. An interesting landscape scale twist on that topic is provided by this Huang et al. Study from Coweta. Climate change may increase the drought stress of mesophytic trees downslope with ongoing forest mesophication under a history of fire suppression. And here what they were interested in was this used multiple methods from remote sensing to long-term ecological plots and so forth. And what they were looking at was, in general, under the historic landscape conditions, you would expect the forest on the uplands to have been fairly sparse. So in the photograph on the left, you can imagine those forests would have been fairly sparse in the foreground, and then they wouldn't have consumed all the water through evapotranspiration, and much of the water would have drained down slope to subsidize the growth of the mesophytic forest in the coves. What they actually found was that the forest on the upslope areas today are thriving and are actually growing more rapidly relative to their historic growth rate than the ones in the mesophytic forest in the bottoms. The reason they postulate for that can be seen in the two diagrams at top. Top left would represent historical conditions, a fairly sparse forest in the xeric upslope sites. The green arrows represent evapotranspiration. So the upslope forest had a fairly low evapotranspiration rate because they were sparse. And that left quite a bit of water, those large blue arrows, to drain down slope and to subsidize the mesophytic forest in the valleys, which have a large green arrow representing large amounts of evapotranspiration. There was also a fairly large amount of large quantity of water discharged through the streams. Today, with longer growing seasons and more vegetation, a denser vegetation in the upslope areas, those forests are thriving, really. They're not as stressed as the downslope forest. Those upslope forests are placing greater demands on evapotranspiration, indicated by the large arrow large green arrow, there's less water flowing down slope, indicated by those small blue arrows. So less water subsidizing the mesophytic forest down slope, which means those mesophytic forests are stressed and the streams are receiving less water. This is interesting because usually when we think about the negative implications of fire suppression, we think about the decline in xerophytic forests and fire adapted species like oaks and pines. But here we see also an impact on the mesophytic forests and the coves as well. And then finally, just briefly here, climate change and the prognosis for wildfires and prescribed burning. The work done on this suggests, here's one for the southeastern United States, suggests that we might expect, this is based on general circulation models, future climate possibilities. The climate will likely be more favorable for greater wildfire exposure in the future. And this one by Kupfer, John Kupfer et al. Is called Climate Change Projected to Reduce Prescribed Burning Opportunities in the Southeastern United States. They looked at burn windows in the southeastern United States. And in the study area that's represented by the red line on the left, they looked at burn windows for prescribed burning and how those might change in the future based on modeled on general circulation model downscaling analyses. And so just briefly, the top row represents current conditions, and then the two bottom rows represent future conditions that might be possible. The red represents very low numbers of days per growing season or per fire burning season when it would be favorable, when the weather would fall within the burning windows. The green represents more favorable burning conditions. And I see that I'm out of time here, Ron, but just about a minute here and I'll finish up, okay? So the general change is that the amount of green diminishes such that the burning windows for prescribed fire become much less than they are today. The silver lining here for the Central Appalachian region is that the Appalachian part of the South shows less decline than the rest of the lowland South, because it's not as close to the upper limits in terms of temperature and humidity and everything as the lowland South would be anyway. So in a nutshell, to conclude here, fire was important in the past. It maintained probably open oak and pine stands over much of the landscape. Fire suppression has reduced has reduced the cover of those types of forests and has increased the density such that vegetation is more stressed and more susceptible to drought than it was in the past. And there really is warrant here for continued prescribed burning to help maintain vegetation in a state that helps to resist catastrophic losses of carbon in the future. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Wow. Thank you. That was terrific. Yeah, no need to apologize for going a couple minutes long there. In those last 3 minutes, you answered about half the questions we've got that have came in. So that's impressive.
You didn't know somebody from Southwest Virginia could talk that fast?
Really, again, excellent. I'll get into our questions now, and please keep them coming in the chat. A lot of good questions here. So let's see. First, I'm actually sorry, it's going to take a second because, like I said, half of these have been addressed. So let's first question we'll try to tackle has to do with that study involving the duff and the mycorrhizae. And so this question basically looks at, could you share a little bit about what the mechanism is there? So the prescription of the authors was to try to gradually reduce the duff to give the mycorrhizae and the roots presumably time to grow somewhere else. What is the physiological mechanism by which that occurs with a gradual duff reduction? Well,
you are again outside my expertise. Okay, so I admitted that up front. They're not clear on that as far as I can tell. But this was a management recommendation. I think the idea would be if you gradually reduce the duff, you would start to reduce the amount of roots that are in that duff layer gradually instead of all at once. And so there's just less volume for the roots to inhabit, which would gradually force them to forage down into the soil as well. That's what I take the idea to be. But if somebody else wants to elaborate on that, I'm open to it as well.
Yeah, no need to claim physiological expertise overnight. There's another question here that basically is looking at asking a question about your historic data. So the question is, does fire suppression explain all of the mesophication that we've seen, or do you think that some of the new climate normals showing essentially a significantly wetter central and southern Appalachians over the last century explain some of that mesophication that we've seen? So basically looking at teasing out those two potential drivers.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the wetter climate certainly plays into that. But it's hard to, it's hard to tease them apart, but it would be hard to claim that as the primary mechanism. When you look, for example, at the oak data from the Smoky Mountains that I showed, the mesophication occurred. I mean, the establishment of mesophytic trees occurred in the 1920s and 30s, right after fire suppression. The 20s and 30s were actually fairly dry decades in the southern Appalachians, and so that was when the primary infilling occurred. And so from that perspective, it seems that fire is the primary signal there, fire suppression. But no doubt, I mean, undoubtedly the increased precipitation has contributed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So also another question, I think, is looking back at a comment Mark made early in his talk when talking about physical components related to local climate. And so when we think about the fire-maintained forests and woodlands of previous centuries, do you have any information on how those types of structural forests might differ from today's forests in terms of their albedo? So how does albedo differ between a fire-maintained forest and a fire-suppressed forest?
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I mean, part of it would probably depend on how open the canopy were and to what extent sunlight were penetrating to, say, grasses and soil underneath that might have a higher albedo than tree foliage. With pine, I mean, the pines have a lower albedo really than the hardwoods, and so if pines were more widespread, that would reduce albedo. Although on the other hand, with the infilling of mountain laurel into the understories, they have a fairly low albedo too, and so that would increase the albedo. I don't know. That's an interesting one that goes in a number of different directions, I think. But interesting. Yeah, I don't know. That deserves some meticulous study, I think.
Yeah, maybe we can circle back to that when we have everybody and we think about what remote sensing tools are available optically. Okay, another interesting question here just came into the chat. It says, if mesophytic forest conversion is now leading to more trees stressed by drought, do you think that this could favor a transition back to fire-adapted oak forests as a cyclical response to that stress?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess that's conceivable, although I mean, when you look at one bit of data I didn't show is Don Hagan at Clemson has done some research on that Rock Mountain fire and looking at resprouting of the dead trees. And this is after wildfire, not drought, but it was a wildfire drought combination, and the oaks are not regenerating as well as some of the mesophytic ones. And so, even if there's some mortality from drought or wildfire, now that those mesophytic species are established, I mean, red maple, and some of those mesophytic species can resprout fairly readily. And so it's not like just restoring it. You can't, you go from one state to another. It's hard to get it back to what it was, because now we have a century's worth of establishment of mesophytic species, many of which resprout readily. So I don't know. I mean, it's possible, but I'm skeptical that that would be the case.
Just one more question before we transition here to our panel discussion. So you mentioned two things that kind of combined in my mind. Talked about charcoal and sediment deposition of charcoal when looking at historic fire ecology. Also talked a little bit about stream transport in that last study. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on, with regards to pyrogenic charcoal and its value as a recalcitrant form of carbon, what do we know about the mobility and transport offsite? What I'm thinking is charcoal moving into surface waters and then being further sequestered in the sedimentary layer elsewhere. Do we know much about that?
I don't think we do. I've talked to again Sally Horn, my PhD advisor, about that in terms of its implications for reconstructing fire history using soil charcoal cores from sites. And when you look at those studies of soil charcoal, you see a lot more recent charcoal than in the past. Does that mean that there's been more burning in the past, or does it just mean that over time the soil charcoal is transported off site just by soil creep and other mass wasting? And so, my guess is that it is continually being transported downslope into streams. And then where it goes, that's an important thing too. It could be in alluvium. Some of it, it gets deposited somewhere in the stream, in the fluvial system, I suppose. So I don't know much about that, and I don't think it's well understood. But it does seem clear that soil charcoal has to be transported off-site eventually.